Hello, this is Property Matters, a weekly catch-up on the world of property, supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. We're live every week on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn and our website propertymatterstv.co.uk. If you're watching on the website, leave us a Google review, and if you're watching via social media, get involved in the comments section below. Our email address for any topics you'd like us to discuss, hello@propertymatterstv.co.uk. There's a podcast version, even live every Monday at 10 a.m. if you'd like to get us on the move each week, wherever you get your podcasts from. And also, let's take a look at the property news this week with our property expert, Joe Joshi, and a bit of a buy-to-let special this week, Joe.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Paul. Yeah, of course. Buy-to-let has its own version. We'll have a deep discussion on that, I'm sure, from where it started its journey to where it's now going.
So let's take a quick look at this week's main story. Some 350,000 buy-to-let fixed-rate mortgages are set to mature this year, and the extra £225 a month that landlords might have to pay could impact the rental market dynamics, says a lender. The private rented report from the Mortgage Works says that while the majority of rented stock was owned outright, for the 40% mortgaged properties, the significant rise in interest rates since late 2021 was a major challenge. They said that this was particularly true as most buy-to-let mortgages were on an interest-only basis. In 2023, 0.95% of outstanding buy-to-let mortgages were in arrears of 3 months or more, higher than the 0.76 proportion among homeowners. They said it was reassuring that this remained low by historic standards. The lender put this down to landlords being on longer-term fixes for 5 years, allowing them to adjust to the environment, as well as having mortgages at 75% loan-to-value, which relatively shielded them from higher interest rates. It also said that strong rental growth offered landlords some relief. So it's interesting, isn't it, that outstanding buy-to-let mortgages in arrears are slightly higher than they are in the domestic market, in the homeowner market.
Yes, I mean, that's fundamental. It's a bit of a snowball effect, really, Paul. That's why it's probably that way inclined, because obviously when interest rates went up quite dramatically, 14 rises pretty much consecutively from a very low rate of 0.25, 0.1%, right the way up to now 5.25%. The difference in payments started making a lot of differences, not just for the landlords, obviously, but also from tenants who were not able to keep up with the mortgage payments, with the rental payment, which ultimately affected the landlords. And also in came the cost of living at the same time. But under the circumstances, I think landlords have fared well in terms of the amount of arrears that they may have been in. And it's mostly because of the disparity, the differences between what was coming in as to what was beginning to be going out.
The Mortgage Works said that there'd been a dramatic shift in the number of people renting aged between 55 and 64, with an 80% rise in private rentals within this group over the last decade. This coincided with a drop in home ownership rates across this demographic, which is now around 10% lower than its peak in 2007. Among people aged 45 to 54, there was a 45% rise in private renters from 2013 to 2023, while the number of renters aged 65 and older increased by 46%. Over the same time period, the report also showed a 4% fall in private renters aged 25 to 34. So, I mean, the interesting thing is, isn't it, that actually, as a marketplace, buy-to-let looks really exciting. You've got more and more older people coming in and needing to rent, presumably because they've had problems in the past with endowment mortgages or something of that nature, or they've spent the money and taken the money out and it's gone. So you've got more and more older people needing to rent, which is increasing your pool of potential tenants. The prices are going through the roof. I mean, if that was a marketplace for anything other than buy-to-let, you'd say it was a very healthy market, and yet people are leaving in droves because of the cost.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a healthy market, but you have to remember the time span at that's end of the Richter scale also is shortened, as opposed to where the younger generation might be, and sort of first time buyers and youngsters in the perhaps, 25 to 35, 25 to 45 age bracket. Because obviously with work, facilities, and moving, they are probably a stronger rental for a long term. Though they want to get off that rental market as quickly as possible and become a home owner rather than someone that is paying someone else's mortgage. And the reason for the other end of that is a number of reasons, as you pointed out. Some of it's to do with endowments, some of it's to be able to pay off their interest only mortgages. So they may have had a 25-year interest only mortgage, which may have come to an end, and they've had to literally sell their property, clear off that interest, and whatever's left is what they're now having to live off. So they would take a rental property, flat, house, whatever it might be, to continue their lifestyle, but have that fallback, knowing that they've got some of that equity from when they've sold up, and probably not enough to be able to go and buy another property in some cases, depending on what part of the country you're in. I mean, if you're in central London, you may have done quite well and thought, okay, well, I can clear off my mortgage and I've got enough to go and cash purchase a little bit further out. But those that were not in those areas and had to clear off those debts would have probably ended up with having to rent for the balance of their life, and that may be all over the place. And sometimes people have moved further afield to get better value in rental, though rental prices have gone up pretty much across the board.
That fall of 4% in private renters between 25 and 34 is an interesting one. I'm guessing that's the effect of the bank of mum and dad, perhaps.
Absolutely, and also in terms of people wanting to buy, the opportunity has been stronger. There's been more rental property or former rental property that's come on the market where people have thought, well, I'm not making ends meet. I can't cover the mortgage that is going to be on the increase. The buy-to-let mortgage is much expensive, so there's been a lot more stock available, and most of that stock has been properties that were formerly rented out by the people that bought those as buy to let. And so that's given the first time buyers with the youngsters an opportunity, and the bank of mum and dad have obviously then helped in order to secure those, and they may have been secured at better prices only because one wants to get out and the other one wants to get in.
If you want to see what's happened to the buy-to-let market in terms of landlords, here's your stat that proves it. There's been a major change in how landlords invest in the market. So 43% hold just one rental property in 2021. That's compared to nearly 80% in 2010. So that's halved in just over a decade. The number of people with one single property has halved. And that's where the exodus has seemed to have come from. The figure of the numbers of people who've got five or more properties has risen significantly in the same period. And these landlords have a disproportionate role in the private rental sector, as they accounted for nearly half of all tenancies. By 2021, just over half of landlords had been in the market for 11 or more years, and less than a tenth were recent entrants who had been in the sector for 3 years or less. So it's those with the one property, it's the accidental landlords that are giving up, I think, because they don't want the leaky taps and they can't make the sums work.
Yeah, the leaky taps forever. Yes, I agree, and the accidental landlords are the ones that have sort of come out, and wisely so, to be honest with you. You get one property, the taxation laws have changed, the interest rates have changed, the amount of money that they're getting from the rental is probably not covering what they're doing. So it's almost better for them to get out whilst they're ahead and concentrate on enjoying life rather than assisting people with a leaky tap. But the ones that are in there for the long haul, or the 5+ owners, have got enough equity in some of those properties to be able to continue to buy others, and perhaps have gone and ridden the storm of all the taxations, and of course the increase in mortgages and increase in the potential income that they can have. They've got something to contra, whereas when you've just got the one property, it's difficult to contra with anything else other than to say to yourself, well, this is not paying. And if you have a void period, anything from a month to 2 months, all of a sudden the whole financial status changes completely, and so that's why those accidental landlords, and there will be new accidental landlords that will come in. But the biggest thing is that if someone's got £100,000, £50,000, whatever spare cash that they would normally have put into a buy to let, one-off investment, they are getting good returns now with fixed rates from building societies. So one really questions how much do you want to actually go and become an accidental landlord, for the sheer headache of what it actually will bring in. So it speaks volumes for itself. But it had that not sort of been the case, then we would have continued down the buy-to-let market, and people would have continued to buy. And I'm not saying it's all over; it will come back. But there are so many new regulations for buy-to-let landlords and for letting agents, and actually, it's actually veering off quite a lot of people out of that marketplace.
Those that are selling with their one property seem to be selling to those with five or more, because that's where the growth is. And you can see from these other stats here that, interestingly, the share of rented houses across England had stayed broadly around 19% over recent years. That's following rapid growth between 2000 and 2015, of course, when the rates were really low. So there were around 4.6 million households in the private sector in 2023, just below the 2017 peak of 4.7 million. So the pool of rented houses is roughly the same. It's just that the profile of who the owners are of those properties that is changing. It's particularly difficult, they say, to discern at present, noting that the tenant demand and rental growth are both strong, which is my point earlier. Although with housing affordability under pressure, potential homeowners were more likely to stay in rented accommodation for longer. So even that's a positive from a landlord's perspective. Understanding the dynamics of the sector has been never so important, says Damian Thompson, who's Director of Landlords at the Mortgage Works. He said the sector continues to support the lives of millions of people across the UK by providing homes for those who either can't afford to buy or prefer not to own a home. And that's an interesting point from where the new government sits, isn't it? Because, you've got all these millions of people and millions of households sitting there, 4.6 million households sitting there, and there's been no real investment in that industry from government in terms of direction for years.
Well, I mean, the buy-to-let market was decimated by the Conservatives, in all honesty. When it was going really good, they took their eye off the ball, and those landlords left in droves. Whereas now, the problem is there's a huge shortage in the private sector for rental properties because of all those changes that they made. And I'm not particularly sure and certain that the new change of guard is going to do anything amazingly different for them. But what they will realise as time goes on is that it's a very, very important sector. And what they've done is shot themselves in the foot, because all those people that are either homeless or need accommodation, which the local authorities and the government cannot afford to invest into, have been taken away because they've made it so difficult and so unaffordable, and so expensive for private landlords to continue to invest in the buy-to-let market. So they're going to have, they're going to end up doing what they've done for asylum seekers for some time now, and put a bill of something like £7 million a day for hotels and accommodation, because it's a bad policy and they haven't really thought about it. So the governments, both, whether it's red, blue or yellow, all of them are made a mistake in losing a very valuable sector of the market, the buy-to-let market, by actually changing all the laws and rules in favor of the tenant to a large extent, because they want to have that tenant, once they've got the tenant into the property, the government is giving them certainty of staying in the property. Now work that out really. The reason why they want them to have a stay in the property is because the government really don't want them back. They don't want them back at their council offices or their place to say, I'm now being made homeless. So that's where the problem is. So landlords are saying, well, look, we could have a unruly tenant that is in our property causing us a mayhem, not paying their rent. But because the government has made all these rules, they're stuck with them. And that's what's veered them off. And this Section 21 that was up in arms for the last Conservative government is going to be a continuation, as far as I'm concerned, that will drive people away because it is veered more towards the tenant than it is towards the landlord. And the landlord's saying, "Well, hang on, I'm investing my hard saved money, hard earned money into a property in order to say, well, actually, I can make more." But what's happening is I'm actually becoming a charitable trust because all of a sudden the tenant may not pay me for 2, 3, 4, 5 months, and the council aren't going to pay me, and I can't kick them out. So they actually are kicking themselves out of the marketplace, which is leaving the government out in the cold.
It's a buy-to-let special this week on Property Matters, and here's our second set of figures that show us exactly what's happening in buy-to-let right now. Landlords bought just a tenth of all homes sold in Great Britain during the first half of 2024, says new research, the lowest share of purchases since records began. This is a study done by Hamptons. It says that the lowest level of sales since 2010 and less than 15% share of homes landlords purchased in 2015. Just before tax and regulatory changes were introduced. So that was the height of the market in 2015 when they changed all the rules, like you said earlier on. Now it's down to a tenth of the market from 15%. And compared to last year, that was down 1%. So Hampton said this affected the appeal of buy-to-let investment and added that more recently this was further impacted by high mortgage rates, political uncertainty, and the potential of new rental regulations that you mentioned. It found the share of purchases made by buy-to-let investors had been declining over the year and reached a low of 9.7% in June. If this continues, Hamptons predicts there will be 113,630 new buy-to-let purchases this year, a reduction of 75,900 or 40% compared to 2015. So there's your damage, Joe, a reduction of 75,900 or 40% compared to what was going on in 2015. That just goes to show what all those changes and also the environment around buy-to-let has done.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps I commented on this subject in the last, but it's clearly a subject that tallies together, and it's clear from the statistics now you've just shared with us that the buy-to-let market has been decimated by the changes of rules and government and costs and so forth. So it's actually the country and the government that is at a greater loss than they are for the buy-to-let. What you have to remember is those people that were investing, and they were investing in buy-to-let because there were 2 or 3 reasons. One, because they liked the safety of property. Two, there's always chance of getting a capital growth. And three, it was doing a good job for the country by providing extra accommodation invested by individuals. Even if it was one extra property, it meant that somebody else was going to come off the homeless ladder. But by doing what they've done, they've actually taken all these people away. And those people are now saying, well, actually, if I've got £50,000 that I would have put down as a deposit on a buy-to-let, which is now costing more. So we look at a rate which is 5.25% base at the moment, and then maybe a couple of percent more for a buy-to-let. Fixed rate might come a bit differently, but it's just so much more expensive that the rental market has become so expensive for people to rent. The scary part of that is that people go into these properties and show that they can. And if their circumstances change, then all of a sudden they are in a property that they actually physically can't afford to pay for. But the law then allows them to stay where they are until they can be in a position to pay for it. And in that time, the landlord is suffering because he's not getting his rent money, and subsequently he's not in a position to pay his mortgage. So it's just become a complete farce in what they were doing. And why should they want to do that? Well, the reality is that if you've got a 50,000, 75,000, £100,000 deposit saved or available for an investment, they can now put that into a fixed long-term bond or whatever with the building society and get a 5-6% return, and so and without the headache and without the headache of a leaky tap. So they haven't helped themselves, and all of a sudden there's a lot of people that are not in a position to rent. And because there's not enough properties to rent, and you just stated in those figures there how many people from the buy-to-let market have come out.
Yeah, some interesting stats from Hamptons here. They say 146,060 more homes would be sold by private landlords this year, offsetting the 113,630 estimated purchases. This will mean that landlords have sold 328,750 more homes than they've bought since 2016. So it's a third of a million homes that have not been that have been sold more than have been bought in the rental market by buy-to-let landlords. They say institutional investments into larger rental developments, such as build-to-rent, have filled some of the gap, but there's still fewer homes available for rent. In June, there were 42% fewer homes in Great Britain than the same month in 2016. That's quite something, isn't it? 42% fewer rental homes in Britain, and that's why prices are rising.
That's right. It's always down to supply and demand, isn't it? That if the demand is high and the rental demand is very high at the moment, the supply has become limited. What is available becomes expensive to rent. But like I said, the scary part of that is, when people move in and have to justify affordability, it's only a case of when something happens in their life that all of a sudden then they're not in a position to afford those rents. But because of the policies, they are in a much stronger position to stay where they are until they get themselves sorted. In the meantime, the landlord is going to have to pick up the tab and make sure that he continues to do that, which is part of the reason in the earlier report we talked about the number of landlords that might have been in arrears is because of just those circumstances that have happened. And that, again, doesn't help those landlords, and they're under pressure because their credibility gets affected. So, it's a real balance to try and make sure that their credibility doesn't get affected, credit score doesn't get affected for other properties that they may wish to borrow and buy, against the amount of money that they're getting in from their tenants.
Hamptons say that rather than a mass landlord sell-off, it's the lack of homes available to rent that has been caused by fewer investors entering the market. So it's not everyone selling off; it's just there's not new investors coming in. Since 2016, this has been the main culprit. But these disincentives to invest have been compounded more recently by, of course, these higher interest rates and the political uncertainty, and of course the threat of reform. If investor purchases and sales continued at the 2015 levels, in other words, if they hadn't made those changes in 2016, there would likely be 450,000 more private rented homes in Great Britain by the end of this year. That's roughly equivalent to the total number of homes in Birmingham. Most investors purchased this year have been driven by cash-rich, larger portfolio landlords who continue to expand their portfolios. They're hoovering up all those little accidental places up for sale, aren't they?
Well, they are, and along with institutional landlords, where basically they can see that there is now a gap in the market. They've got the money, or they've got the facilities, or they've got the land to build. They're the ones that are now sort of saying, okay, well, look, let's just take up, all the slack here. But by taking that control, what they also are doing is increasing those rents, because they can, because they are the ones that are controlling a majority of the property. So that buy-to-let area becomes very expensive to rent in. Equally, it's a good return for the institutional. So if they're getting a great return, 10, 12% out of the whole portfolio, then that's an excellent return against what they would get if their money was stuck in a builder society and being saved. And they can contra other costs as well, where they've actually got an active business, where if they're just taking a savings, they're likely to pay their income tax. So it may not be as attractive. But the short term, the one-man band, the one-man accidental landlord probably takes that risk and says, well, actually, I'd rather just save my money, put it into an account, or of course, invest it into a first-time property for their children, grandchildren, and so forth, where they're helping them get onto the property ladder.
Yeah, you've got options these days, haven't you, with higher interest rates. It's interesting what they're saying about landlords. The picture is not uniform across the country, Joe. There's landlords are really looking at where those high yield regions are, and they're looking particularly at a place like the Northeast, for example, where we've always had historically low property prices. The share of buy-to-let homes purchased in the Northeast rose from 24% in 2015 to 25% this year. So they've bucked the trend. Similarly, the place with the lowest yields, which you can imagine will be London, that's got the biggest fall since 2015. The lowest level of buy-to-let investor purchases was in Scotland, making up just 5% of the market so far this year, down from 10% in 2015 and 7% in 2019. This aligned with stricter regulations for rentals brought in during COVID and the introduction of a 6% stamp duty charge on second homes in 2022. So it looks as if the Scottish government punishing the landlords even more.
Well, yes, but the fact is that it's the demographics that are moving up to the north and northeast and so forth, coming away from the south. That's what's pushing those prices up in that sector, and also they're getting a better value for money, even though in the south you might pay a three-bedroom house nowadays almost £2,000 a month, which is quite colossal in terms of rent. Where at one time that was only probably about 1,000, 1,800, 1,200 pounds a month. So it's gone almost double to what it used to be. Whereas perhaps in the north or northeast or the areas that are not as highly popular, you're getting more value for money. And even if they were paying £1,500, they're still saving another £500. But of course, it's the area that makes the difference, and it's not attracting people that are going to be employed or employable at a certain time and age of their life. So they're just looking at a separate sector, like the sector we talked about earlier, which are perhaps the elderly who've actually come out of their property, sort of sold it off, cleared their mortgage, and then moved to another part and allowed themselves to have a better life and also a better value for money.
Hamptons say that the strong rental growth, along with the stagnant property prices, has actually pushed up the yield for buy-to-let investors this year. They're saying in England and Wales, the average is 7.3%. This was up 1 percentage point on 2015 and higher than the average yield of 7% last year. It means the average investor would earn an additional £1,906 a year in rent on a £200,000 purchase than if they bought it in 2015. Some 16% of new investors had a gross yield that was higher than 10%, up from a share of 14% of landlords achieving a similar return in 2013. Hamptons recorded a continued rise in rents in June, finding the average tenant paid £1,347 per month for a new home. This was 5.8% or £74 higher each month than if it had been the same as last year. The firm said it meant that rents were rising nearly 3 times faster than inflation, which was 2% in June. So some interesting figures there. I mean, 7% or 7.3%, yes, it's slightly higher than what you get in a building society, but if you put your money wisely, you wouldn't be getting probably just 1% less than that, maybe, just over that perhaps, and you wouldn't have all the hassle.
Well, exactly. That's the fair point to make here. Yes, they are getting 7%, but in all honesty, that 7% is not washing its face, because base rate is 5.25%. So if you are even paying an extra percent on a buy to let, you're gonna only earn maybe 0.5% or a percent increase. And if you take out all the running costs and so forth, you're actually in a deficit. So it just doesn't make good sense. You really need to be netting at the moment 10%, so that you have a margin of error from that 7.5%. So you've got a couple of percent to turn around. But if you look at the percentage point in the grand scheme, you're much safer. And this is not an encouragement from my part, because obviously I'm in property and I want people to buy more property. But I can see the sense that it encourages them to go to a building society and say, well, I'll just play safe, and take my 6% as opposed to my 7.5%. But I'm only going to get 6% net because I'm going to have to spend most of the time doing all those bits to it. So it doesn't make sense. It has to be at a level that it gives them some sort of margin. And that's where the institutional guys benefit more than the one accidental landlord, or even the guy who's renting out 5 properties, because he hasn't got the buying power, the strength to be able to keep all the costs down on a mass basis, which the landlords that are becoming institutional landlords have a stronger buying power.
They say that there would have been a bright side, which is the fact that at least some of these buy-to-let landlord or investors' properties would end up in the hands of first-time buyers. But of course, by the same problem. Higher mortgage rates and rising rents have actually locked them out of it as well. So it means that actually, despite the fact that you'd have maybe wanted them to go to those first-time buyers, they're getting kept out by the higher rents and also, of course, the higher mortgage rates in the first place. But that's where I guess probably the bank of mum and dad comes in to fix the problem.
Well, yes, because Bank of Mum and Dad will obviously be able to give a larger deposit where possible, so keeps the mortgage costs down, allows to consider a fixed rate over the next 3 to 5 years, which might be, 1.5% less than what the base rate is. So all of those things starts to conjure up a better deal for the first time buyers. But again, if Bank of Mum and Dad are refinancing, they're going to be refinancing at a higher rate now than they were previously. So there's a price to pay all the way along the line. It's just a case of what works for each individual going forward. But yes, I mean, the buy-to-let market, as it was, and the reason it was there, has actually been now decimated by the current policies. And I can't see that getting better unless they start to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that what they've done is actually made all the landlords, or even the accidental landlords, run away from that sector of the market.
Well, that's our wrap up on the buy-to-let state of the market right now. I hope that was of interest to you. Don't forget to join us again for another Property Matters very soon.